This will be our last session of recorded lessons, and it will also be our final session on trade. So in this week, we're going to learn about exchange rates and purchasing power parity, how countries manage currency exchange, and also the concept of international reserves. So first of all, the question is, how do people trade given that there are actually different currencies? We talked last time about trade and about terms of trade, but that was all very hypothetical. In order to actually facilitate trade, you have to have currency trade first. And you can see a few items here that are priced in different countries, currencies or different countries' pricing systems, which is really confusing. If you see something that's 4.99 British pounds or euros, you don't necessarily know how much that's going to cost out of your money. So, currency exchange precedes the actual exchange of goods and services. If you want to buy something from France, technically, you have to be able to get euros first. Now, of course, most of the time that we buy imported items, we're buying them at stores, and the stores have actually done the whole exchanging currencies and importing the goods, right? So we don't normally see that. But if you go to a different country, you understand that in order to spend money there, you generally do need to convert into their currency. So this graph just shows you very simple how we would draw one currency market. If the market was for the yen, we would put the dollar price of a yen or dollars per yen on the y-axis, quantity of yen on the x-axis, and then it's a very simple, basic supply and demand, just like we talked about way back in micro. But when we draw foreign exchange markets, we pretty much always draw two graphs. There are always two graphs because there are two prices, and there is no single price against which we can measure other countries' currencies or values. So this particular set of graphs is for the relationship between the dollar and the euro. And this one is labeled euro price of a dollar, and the x-axis says quantity of dollars. So this is actually the dollar market. Okay, another way to put this label for the y-axis is euros per dollar. All right, over here we have the euro market, and we know that because it's the dollar price of a euro and the quantity of euros on the x-axis. And again, you could also just call this dollars per euro. Okay, so in these two markets, we have in each market supply and demand. So nothing too surprising there. And let's say that the two currencies start out at approximately a 1-for-1 ratio. So the euro price of a dollar is 1, and we're just going to call this Q1 because I don't know how many would be being exchanged. And sorry, I drew this a little bit lower, but let's just imagine in the units on this one, this is also 1. Okay, and that is basically how they started out in 2002. So if it's 1-to-1 and then suddenly the demand for euros goes up, which did happen over time, right, for whatever reason, because people want to vacation in Europe, or because people want to buy more European imports, or because people are afraid of buying the dollar, or don't like the dollar, or don't like America, or whatever, right? So if demand for the euro goes up, that will cause appreciation. Let's say this becomes $1.25, right? Or that would be 5/4 as a fraction, right? $1.25. Okay, so what's going to happen on the graph on the left? Well, it can't possibly stay the same, because if it costs $1.25 to buy a euro, then you can't possibly buy a euro for $1, right? So something has to happen over here. And if one of the currencies appreciates, the other currency must necessarily depreciate. And because they are linked like this, so if this is the dollar price of a euro, if the dollar, sorry, this was the dollar price of, if $1.25 buys you 1 euro, then $1 equals what? 1/1.25, right? Or the inverse. So if $1.25 is 5/4, then this must be 4/5 or 0.8. So hopefully the math makes sense there. I kind of went back and forth between decimals and fractions, which makes sense in my head. But that would mean that if a US dollar buys you 1 euro, or $1.25 to buy 1 euro, then $1 buys you 80 euro cents, right? Which means over here, we must have fallen to 80 cents as the price. The problem is, how do we get there? Well, there's only two ways to get there, by either having supply increase or demand decrease. And what economists believe happens is actually that supply increases. So the reason we end up at this new 80 cents over here, besides the fact that we have to, because these two graphs have to have reciprocals, the other reason is because when people go to buy euros, okay, this supply curve is people who are supplying in the dollar market, right? People who are willing to trade. And they're the same people who are demanding euros over here. So in this foreign exchange market, the people who are supplying dollars are the people who are demanding euros. And if you want to buy more euros, you have to supply more dollars. Likewise, the supply over here, this is the supply of people who are willing to trade their euros for dollars, right? They're the same as the people who are demanding dollars. So those two graphs are going to be very, very closely linked. If demand shifts in one, supply must shift in the other. All right, so what causes this? What causes appreciation, depreciation? Well, appreciation and depreciation are caused by shifts in supply and demand in the currency market. What causes shifts in supply and demand? Well, for one thing, demand for a nation's goods and services, including tourism. So if more people suddenly want to travel to Japan, then demand for the yen will go up. If more people suddenly want to put foreign investment in India, then demand for the rupee would go up. So whatever the demand is, the demand for the currency will follow. It's almost like a derived demand. Supply of the currency can also impact it, meaning supply of the currency being exchanged, for one thing, but also the total overall supply of the currency, which is going to be linked to inflation. So if, for example, the money supply of the dollar increases, and if the money supply increases, generally we would expect the value of the dollar to go down, right? The price of the dollar would go down. What do we think would happen in international markets? Well, if a dollar becomes worth less domestically, it's probably going to become worth less internationally as well. So probably what will happen is demand for the dollar will decrease, right? And so we could think of it in terms of any market. Let's say we're doing the yen per dollar market, quantity of dollars, right? And this is the dollar market in relation to the Japanese yen. Well, if we're having inflation in the United States, people in Japan probably are not as excited about buying our currency because they don't see it as stable anymore. So demand would decrease, right? And that would cause our currency to depreciate. So inflation and depreciation are not the same thing, but inflation does cause depreciation. Interest rates can be another factor. If interest rates, for example, in Canada are higher than interest rates in U.S. banks, then people in the U.S. might want to put their money in Canadian banks. In order to put their money in Canadian banks, they first have to exchange their U.S. dollars into Canadian dollars. So if you have a high interest rate, a growing or rising interest rate is going to make your money more attractive. Your banks are going to be more attractive as a place to store wealth, and therefore the demand for the currency will also go up. Political unrest, of course, is going to have the opposite effect. If a country is destabilized, people don't want their currency because they can pretty much predict that it's going to lose value. So if there's political unrest in a country, we would predict that the supply of their currency being offered for exchange will increase and the value of their currency will decrease. Okay, so here are some questions. You can pause and look at them. And the answers. Suppose the Bank of England would like to keep the pound at or above its current level. If the pound depreciates against the dollar, so right now the pound is depreciated, the only way to get it to appreciate again is to get people to actually buy the pound. So the Bank of England could actually buy its own currency to increase demand for it and cause it to appreciate. The second question, if the exchange rate of yen per dollar increases from 100 yen equals $1 to 110 yen equals $1, then it's going to take more yen to buy a dollar. So even though it looks like, oh, more yen, right? Like, oh, it's appreciated. It's actually the opposite. When it takes more to buy something, the value of that currency has depreciated. So B is not true. The dollar is not depreciated. The yen has. C is not true, right? So now we need to think about what's this going to mean for actually buying goods. Well, if the Japanese currency depreciates, their goods are actually going to become cheaper, not more expensive. So A is wrong. And if you look at D, U.S. produced goods become more expensive. Yes, it costs people in Japan more to buy a dollar. Therefore, it costs them more to buy U.S. goods. All right, we won't spend too much time on this. What we've been looking at is what we call a floating or flexible exchange system, and that's where we just let the currencies float in reaction to whatever people want, whatever people want to buy and sell. We did have, for a long time, the Bretton Woods system, which was implemented in 1944, and in that case, each nation tied their exchange rate to the U.S. dollar. All exchange rates were fixed, and the U.S. dollar was linked to gold at $35 an ounce. But in 1971, Nixon ended that and terminated the convertibility to gold, and that ended up basically destroying the fixed exchange rate system. Doesn't mean that there's no sort of government manipulation now, but certainly a whole lot less than there was before. So reserve currencies, most countries in the world keep some of their wealth or their assets in what's called reserve currencies. And the US dollar and the euro are the leading ones. So a lot of countries, for example, Indonesia, would have an account filled with a certain number of US dollars, a certain number of euros. That's money they're keeping in case their own currency loses value, so that they're actually able to still, be a player in the world market and function. The US dollar tends to be about 62% of reserve currencies, and the euro about 25%. And there's also something called, sorry, there's an extra S there, special drawing rights, and that's actually a calculated sort of, it's almost like a consumer price index. It's a strange name, but it's basically just like a single number that represents a basket of the US dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, and the British pound. And so it's sort of like a fake international currency called special drawing rights. And China has proposed that those should be used for international payments instead of there being so much reliance just on the US dollar. But so far that hasn't happened. There was also pressure from Iran for a while for petroleum to be traded in euros, but with some of the instability of the euro in the last few years, that has also disappeared. Purchasing power parity is the idea that basically if it costs, let's say, $1 to buy 100 yen, then something that costs $1 in the United States, like what costs $1? Let's say a candy bar should cost 100 yen in Japan. Okay, the idea is that if exchange rates are allowed to float freely, that there won't be any opportunity for what we call arbitrage. And that's clearly not true. If you look at the Big Mac index, sorry, part of it's covered up here, you can see that a Big Mac that costs $3.41 in the United States costs only $1.45 in China after you've actually exchanged currencies, and it costs over $5 in Denmark. So it's not quite true. So people are actually able to take advantage of this, and as I said, it's called arbitrage. And that means that, let's say, $1 buys 100 yen, but I go to Japan and I find a piece of candy that would cost $1 in the US, and I see that it only costs 50 yen, right? So I say, wow, I should buy that candy. I'll bring it back to the US and I'll sell it for twice as much, right? That's what would happen, and you could actually do that and you can make money at it. But the idea is that if demand for the candy goes up, right, then demand for the yen needs to go up. And so eventually that arbitrage opportunity should be wiped out by flexible exchange rates. Okay, a little bit on balance of payments. This is probably not a huge thing for the Ricardo division, but when we refer to trade, when we refer to imports and exports, that's actually all happening within what we call the current account. Imports, exports, tourism, transfer payments, meaning sending money to a different country, like to help Haiti with aid. That's all in the current account. There's also another account called the financial account, or sometimes called the capital account, and this includes longer term payments. So for example, buying a hotel or a factory in a different country, or buying stocks or bonds from a different country. The financial account is much less talked about in the news, but these two accounts tend to balance each other out. So if you have a current account trade deficit, which is what we have with China, meaning that our imports from China far exceed our exports to China, but we will then have a surplus in this account because the money they have, the dollars that they're earning off us, they have to find their way back to the United States in order to have value. And so the direction in the financial account is the opposite. There are a lot more people in China buying U.S. stocks and bonds than vice versa. So if we have a deficit in one account, we will have a surplus in the other account. Okay, so you can look through these notes and see that those two things will zero each other out. I'm not going to spend time on these practice questions. Oh, there's a little bit more here just to review growth, which you can look at on your own too, and how we can define growth, and what the causes of growth are. Obviously, technology, capital, low interest rates that lead to more technology and capital. And one final note here, sort of randomly inserted, which is that Malthus was an 18th century economist, and you probably heard about Malthus because he predicted that there would be widespread starvation because the population increases faster than the agricultural production. But thanks to growth, actually output and production grew much faster, and per capita GDP and nutrition is higher than ever. The end.